Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Don't forget tpublic.com for your shopping needs. Need I say more? I don't much care for coincidences. It makes me wonder what's going on to cause these things to happen. I was giving my dogs baths Monday, and I put expanded perspectives on my phone. Something to listen to. Cam Hale and Kyle Filson were talking about Pail Crawlers. Well, I had started working on my show Saturday. I didn't update their show until Monday. The more things like this that happen, the more I wonder about what Edgar Cayce had said about the collective consciousness. If Paranormal Sideshow has the same subject, I'm going to go out and buy a lottery ticket. There's some strange things going on out there. The folks have seen a crazy-looking creature moving about, usually at night, but not always. They've also heard some things that they can't explain. Creatures that don't fit into any of the many categories of animals or humans known to inhabit our planet. Here are a few more unknown things from around the country to keep your eyes open for next time you're awake. In 2010, the three young men decided they wanted to do some ghost hunting. They set out on their quest, driving around Effingham, Illinois, looking for haunted places to check out. One place they thought would surely have some ghosts was the Casbar Cemetery. Why spirits would hang out in a cemetery is beyond me. They probably seldom visited the place while they were alive. Why would a spirit be so attached to its mortal remains that it would stay with their body long after that last breath was taken? Yet, we hear about sightings in cemeteries all the time. Any time a graveyard is messed with, the activity is ramped up. We have no answers. We can only accept the fact that places filled with dead folks is likely to be filled with spirits as well. Armed with only their cell phones, the three drove to the cemetery. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, and the night was quiet and still. As they drew close to the graveyard, one of them spotted a set of yellow eyes watching from the brush. It was on the side of the road. The eyes were too low to the ground to be a deer, and they were too high up to be a possum or a raccoon. They stared at the eyes that seemed to be staring right back. The road curved just enough to get the headlights to aim right at the eyes. What he saw was no animal, at least none he was familiar with. The thing he was looking at had gray, pale skin. It looked leathery in the headlight glow. There wasn't a hair anywhere on this creature. It had a bigger than usual head with large yellow eyes. The body looked human, sort of. The ribs were visible all along the thorax, and the joints were showing through the skin. The arms and the legs were skeletal. This thing was down on all fours, but the arms looked way too long compared to the rest of the body. If the thing were to stand up, he swore it would be at least 7 feet tall. Thinking he was imagining things, he let out with an expletive. One of his companions asked if the other guys were seeing this same weird thing. All 3 men were looking at this alien-looking creature. The car passed right by this creature, allowing them to all get a closer look. The hair on their heads stood on end. They all said it felt like the temperature in the car dropped by several dozen degrees. This thing never moved. It just crouched in the bushes watching them go by. Instead of stopping at the cemetery, they drove straight back home. Nobody said a word on the drive. They all sat there lost in their own minds, trying to come up with explanations on what that thing might be. With time, the 3 began convincing themselves that they hadn't really seen some unknown, unexplained monster on the side of the road. About 6 months went by. One of them was visiting his girlfriend when she received a text from one of her friends. In this text was an image caught on a game camera. The image showed a tall, skeletal creature with gray skin walking along one of the trails in the woods. The creature was hunched over as if it was occasionally using its hands to stay upright. In October of 2012, this same witness found a page on Facebook relating to Weird Effingham. On the page were dozens of reports from people who had seen this same creature in various parts of the country surrounding their hometown. Many of them reported from one or more of the roads leading to the cemetery. In a way, it made him feel better knowing he wasn't going crazy seeing weird creatures lurking in the bushes. In another way, it scared the heck out of him knowing there was some unknown beast or human creature running around out there in the dark. In 2014, on a Facebook news feed belonging to someone this guy knew, he saw an image of the creature once more. He finally built up the courage to tell others he had seen this thing. Others began telling their stories, all dealing with encounters of this unknown, unnamed thing. When I first saw the image, my first thought was I was looking at the Rake, a pale skeletal creature seen from time to time. The name may have come from someone on Creepypasta, but the creature itself was from long ago, before the internet had been formed. Over the course of the next few months, dozens of sightings were told on this Facebook page. I've told my story before about seeing a pale creature under the railroad bridge on I-35. My wife and I were returning from San Antonio, Texas, on a Sunday night, sometime in May or June 2013. My wife had fallen asleep, and so I turned the radio up and I headed south, taking I-35 into Laredo. Of course, I was listening to Coast to keep myself awake. This was back when it was played from 9 in the evening until 6 in the morning. As we approached the north side of town, I turned the cruise control off and I dropped down from 65 to 60 to negotiate the curve under the bridge that crossed the interstate. I was in the right-hand lane as I came closer to the bridge. That's when I spotted what at first looked like some homeless guy, completely naked, scuttling along the embankment of the road. He was skinny, pale-skinned, and his arms and legs looked emaciated. As I passed him, I had a creepy feeling that something about this person was all wrong. The way he moved, as well as the way his arms and legs were bending, was almost animalistic looking. The cement retaining wall the thing was crawling on was set at a 45-degree angle. It would have been very hard to simply crawl up the wall like it did. At this time, I had about 25 years in law enforcement, and I thought about stopping and going back to see what this guy was doing. However, with my wife in the vehicle, and it was close to midnight, I figured it would be best if I just kept going, figuring this guy was drunk and he had disappeared up to the top of the bridge by this time. That feeling of unease helped me make that decision. I told my wife about what I'd seen when we got home, and she said it sounded like just some drunk guy who was living under the bridge and he forgot to put his pants on. After meeting the guys from Expanded Perspectives, a podcast that covers many of the subjects, like I do, up in Jefferson, Texas, and hearing about the show they did, I began listening when I had a chance. They had a show on the Rake, and they described what people were reporting. I looked at the images on the internet that were reported to be this Rake creature, and sure enough, that's what I saw. The creature was paralleling the road, so I never actually saw its face or eyes, but the body shape was as close to the drawings as I care to get. To this day, every time I approach the railroad bridge, I slow down and I take a couple of seconds to look at that retaining wall to see if maybe that thing has come back or not. Down south near the county line, there's a bunch of houses on the Milagro Ranch. Late one night, a man was sitting in his bedroom on the second floor. The window looked out onto the roof of the garage. As he sat there, a white, emaciated creature went sneaking across the roof. He said it moved like a spider that was out looking for its next meal. The man was so shook up, he ran to his closet and grabbed his shotgun. He spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of his room, waiting for this creature to come back. It never did, but he kept an eye out the rest of the night, thinking that he had just seen a rake. Recently, somebody spotted the same creature running across I-35 just south of Loop 20 overpass. They were driving south when they spotted a white, skin and bones looking person come running from the brush on the west side of the interstate. The thing ran across the southbound lanes, jumped the barrier without even slowing down. It crossed the northbound lanes and it disappeared into the brush on the east side. The witnesses said it ran upright on two legs, but it moved more like an animal. The witness was convinced this was no human. It was human-shaped, but it was way too thin, way too pale, and it moved like something out of a horror movie. After looking at the images of the rake, the witness said that was what they had seen. This sighting was in a few hundred feet of the railroad bridge where I'd had my sighting. Mines Road runs north-northwest from Laredo. There's an active strip mine that gives the road its name. Once past the Columbia Bridge, you're either a Border Patrol agent, working on some ranch, or you're an oil field worker. On one of the ranches, one of the workers was told to take some photographs of this equipment that had been set up on the ranch road by his supervisor. This was a quick way to document items being used in the field. The worker clicked a few photos using his cell phone. Later, while looking at the images on his phone, the worker saw something weird standing near one of the pumps. He had caught what looked like a tall, very thin man. The skin was very white, and there wasn't a stitch of clothing or any hair on it. Everybody that looked at this photo said it looked just like the images of the rake on the internet. It was early in the morning and time to get to work. This couple only had one car, so they had to travel together. As they were coming south on Mines Road, almost to the overpass, they saw a weird-looking creature in the middle of the road. It had very light gray-colored skin, and it was crouching right on the center of the road, down on all fours. The couple thought it was like some kind of a weird wolf or a dog of some kind, the way it was sitting. As they drew alongside, this creature suddenly dove right at them. It hit the side of the car with a loud thump, and they felt the impact on the side of their vehicle. The man immediately began to slow down, wanting to have a look to see what he'd hit. As she said, "Don't stop," thinking that this creature might be dangerous, and they didn't know where it had gone to. They continued on to the coffee shop on McPherson, where she worked. Once there, the man got out and examined the side of his car. There was no dent or any scratches, but the dirt had been rubbed away from the side panel right where the thing had hit. And knowing the area where this happened, I asked if the thing might have looked like the rake seen back in May or June of 2013. My sighting had taken place less than a mile from where they'd seen this dog-wolf creature. I showed her an image from the internet, and she said that really did look a lot like what they had seen. Not quite as white, but it was very skinny and pale. Monotus Creek Lake is in the area, and then there are warehouses and brush. I didn't have a photo from my encounter, but there are images on the internet that you can show people, or you can look at for yourself. Back in the bad old days, chemical companies would dump all kinds of nasty goo into Monotus Creek. In January 2000, Dr. Earhart of the Rio Grande International Study Center spoke before the Texas State Senate Special Committee on Border Affairs. He said, "These toxic chemicals are coming primarily from Laredo," saying that unregulated warehouses built along the banks of the creek that feeds into the Rio Grande are the principal threat to the water quality. Now I know this sounds like the plot to a B-movie. Someone or something drinking polluted water, and then it turns into a wolf man or a dog man or some other creepy crawly thing. The trouble is, the idea isn't all that weird. Later on, after the weird wolf sighting, there was a report of a similar creature seen near Texas A&M International out on Loop 20. It's not all that far from the first two sightings to the college, but there are houses all along the route where any kind of a creature would have been seen by somebody outside their home. One explanation that might link these sightings is if the creature people are seeing is moving from place to place by means of a trans-dimensional travel. That is, if these creatures being seen are the same creature and not several of the similar beast. I know it's not a good idea to use one bizarre theory to try to explain away another bizarre event. But then the folks who tell you that don't believe in anything not covered in a thick layer of science. The name we were all using was the Rake after hearing the story on Expanded Perspectives. Then I heard somebody say this thing might have been a Skinwalker. The name just didn't sound right. A Skinwalker looks like whichever animal he or she chooses to look like, not some bizarre creature. If they look like a coyote, they look like a coyote. If they're going to look like a wolf, that's what you will see. As far as I know, there aren't any reports of skinwalkers looking like some unknown creature skulking about. But then if you look on the internet, you will see some pictures of weird-looking creatures that people say are skinwalkers. I'm not an expert on the subject, so who knows? Maybe that's what we're seeing. The thing is very pale, and it doesn't walk, but it kind of crawls or slouches along. I'll go with Pail Crawler until someone finally catches one of these things and we find out what exactly they are. A witness had an encounter in 1994 at Willow Creek in California. His family had been visiting his grandparents' house in the summer of that year. The house was a small two-bedroom cabin in a rugged wilderness area near the Trinity River. One evening, he and his sister were sleeping on the back porch. It was cool out, so they had sleeping bags. Something woke him, and he looked around to the dark yard trying to see what it was. He didn't see anything, but there was an overwhelming sense of dread he couldn't get rid of. He lifted himself up so he could get a better look. At the edge of the yard, next to the fence between the properties, was a pale creature. He said its skin was the color of the moon, kind of a dirty gray. This thing didn't have any hair. It had huge eyes that seemed to glow when the moonlight hit them. The eyes were looking directly at him, as if this thing could see him in the dark on the porch. The face looked almost human, but it was squashed flat. The arms and legs were longer than they should have been compared to the rest of the body. The witness said it looked like there were some rags hanging from its shoulders and hips. This creature looked to be about 7 feet tall. The young man was scared by the thing, and he didn't want to look at it any more. He pulled the sleeping bag up over his head, hoping the thing would go away. After laying there, wondering if the thing had left, he peeked out from the bag. The thing was standing right next to the porch. He could see its hairless body. The legs were right next to him. Its feet were only inches away. The witness pulled the bag up over his head once more, and he lay there trying to not move or make a sound. He stayed that way until the sun came up. At breakfast, the young boy asked if anyone had seen or heard anything last night. No one had any idea of what he was referring to. Later that day, he went out and he looked for any sign of the late-night visitor. There were no footprints or anything that might have been caused by this weird creature. His father tried to convince him that he was probably just having a bad dream. In Ohio, a man was visiting his grandfather. He took note of the fact that this old man seemed uneasy about something. Any time the dog needed to go outside, the old man would go with it, taking his pistol with him. The young man thought this was a bit odd. He asked his grandfather what was bothering him. The old man said there was something hanging around the yard and it didn't seem natural. It was tall, nearly 8 feet, with pale skin, and it was extremely thin. The old man said this thing would stand at the edge of the yard and just stare at the house. These visits had been going on for about 2 months. There was no follow-up to the story. The young man left, and his grandfather never said if the creature was still visiting or not. A man in suburban New York told of an encounter he had with an apparent Pail Crawler. In 2018, thereabouts, he saw a pale creature while walking from his girlfriend's house. He said this creature didn't seem vicious or aggressive, but it did make a clicking sound, and once in a while it would growl. He was taking a shortcut between their houses. They both lived at home with their folks, and they would visit each other whenever they could. If they took the sidewalk, the long way around, it was like about a 20-minute walk. By using the shortcut, they cut it down to about 5 minutes, but they did have to pass under a railroad trestle, and they moved past a homeless camp. Most of these folks were just there waiting for their lives to improve, but a few could be a problem if you didn't watch your back when they were around. As he was passing under the bridge, he saw a pale-skinned, bony creature. It stood about 5.5 to 5'8". It was completely naked. There wasn't a hair on its body. The head was normal size, but the eyes were way too big, and they were yellow. The thing made a sound that was between a click and a growl. It stood there in a kind of a hunched-over attitude until it noticed the young man was looking at it. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek. The young man lost what little nerve he had, and he took off running for home. Once there, he called his girlfriend to tell her about what he had seen. Well, she didn't believe him, but the sound of his voice began to convince her that he had seen something unnatural on the trail between their houses. The young man decided that he had seen a Skinwalker. A few days later, the couple was walking along the trail, close to the one where he'd had his run-in. They found a dead deer on the trail. It looked like something had bit huge chunks out of its body. There's nothing in the area that could have made these marks. The next day, the entire body was gone. As far as we know, no one else in the area has ever seen this creature. In British Columbia back in 2010, 2 men were exploring an area when they ran into something weird. They were walking along a cliff with trees all along the bottom. Inside the tree line, they saw a pale creature standing just on the edge of the brush. This creature looked to be about 8 feet tall. It was pale gray and extremely skinny. It was swaying from side to side. With each movement, its hands would nearly touch the ground at its feet. The arms and the legs were way too long compared to the rest of the creature, and it stood kind of hunched forward. The witnesses didn't want to, but he asked his friend if he was seeing the same thing. His friend said yes, and it was starting to freak him out. They both noticed that the woods around them had suddenly become very quiet. As they stood there staring at this weird being, they began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It was almost like the thing was trying to hypnotize them. They both felt as if death was staring them in the eye. It took some effort, but they managed to pry their gaze away from the thing in the trees and moved quickly back the way they had come. Once away from the area, they began asking around the locals if anyone had ever seen or heard of a pale creature hiding in the woods. People from the First Nations said the thing they had seen was called a sisutl. It was a spirit that lived in the woods, and it was not something you wanted to mess with. The Indians didn't even like to talk about it. They said any time they saw this white creature in the woods, they would immediately turn and go back the way they had come. A man was driving his aunt to the airport in Pennsylvania. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. They were passing through the countryside on a small road. As they were coming close to a barn, the driver spotted something standing next to an electric pole that was right next to the barn. All they could see was the back of this creature. It was pale white with no hair anywhere on its body. It was tall and thin, but there was nothing close to judge just how tall it was. It looked like it had some kind of a dark material hanging from its shoulders. As they got closer to the creature, a feeling of impending dread came over both of them. The closer they got, the worse this feeling became. Once they had passed the thing, the feeling of terror began to slowly abate. Driving away from it, they felt their pulses returning to normal. All either of them could say was it was crazy, spooky-looking thing to see, and they both hoped they would never see it again. A Christmas night, 2007, once again upstate New York, a man was driving along a back road when he saw something walking along the road coming towards him. There were bare fields on both sides of the road. The crops were long gone, and it was cold and barren looking. The thing was on 2 legs, walking like a man. The arms hung down almost to the thing's knees. It must have been about 7 feet tall. The skin was a light tan or a pale gray. There was no hair anywhere on its body, but there seemed to be something growing from its back. The nose was very small, but the mouth was huge. There were either pointy ears on its head or maybe horns. The driver couldn't look away as he got closer to the creature. He was passing it, looking out the driver's window, when the thing let out an ear-shattering scream. The thing then passed out of sight. It wasn't until he had driven a ways down the road before the sense of fear came over him. He began to shake, and he nearly had to stop to get his body under control. In the middle of the country, a man was driving with his fiancée in the car. They both had just left his parents' home, and they were en route to visit some friends. They were driving by a state park when they both saw a pale-skinned creature squatting on the side of the road. It kind of looked human, but it had no hair, and it was very thin. As they got closer, they could see this thing was hunched over roadkill, having a late-night snack. It turned its face in their direction. They went by so quickly they didn't get a good look at its face. It looked kind of human, but it looked very unnatural. In Illinois, a woman was driving home after visiting some friends. Her route took her through a wooded area, with thick trees on both sides of the narrow road. Her boyfriend was traveling to the same area in a car that was just a few hundred feet ahead of her. It was dark and foggy, so they were both going slowly through the dark area. as she was trying to stay on his back bumper so she wouldn't feel so alone, trying to stay in the glow of his taillights. On the left side of the road, she saw somebody crouching. It looked like a small child huddled in a state of desperation. The woman thought some kid had gotten lost in the fog, and so she stopped and rolled down her window. As she tried talking to this lost child. The kid just sat there crying. She got out of her car and she started walking towards this poor kid when it stood up. The creature was well over 6 feet tall. It had pale-colored skin and no hair. It looked right at her and let out with a shrill scream. It then turned and ran into the woods. At first, she was confused by what had just happened. Then the fear set in. What had she just seen standing less than 6 feet from it? As she started thinking maybe it was a demon, or maybe it was an alien from outer space. What could it have been? No animal in that area runs on 2 feet. Nothing could be that thin and still be alive. The sound it made stuck in her mind for days. She called her boyfriend and practically fell apart on the phone trying to tell him about the creature she had seen. Just south of Laredo, near Brownsville, Texas, in 2009, 2 men were traveling along a dirt road. We have lots of old beat-up dirt roads in our area. Just one more place to try to avoid if you can. To save their vehicle from the bumps and holes, they were driving along at about 20 miles an hour. Just ahead of the car, a tall, pale thing darted from one side of the road to the other. It made it across the road before turning towards them and screaming at them. The sound could be felt as well as heard. It was so loud. This thing wasn't anyone in a suit. No one is that skinny and tall. It ran like an animal, but on 2 legs. It had cleared the road in record time. They both thought maybe they had just seen an alien, or maybe it was a ghost. The driver hit the gas and they got out of there as fast as the old dirt road would allow. Also from Texas, only no town was mentioned, a woman was staying with her folks. They were out of town for the day and she was alone in the house. She laid down on her bed for a quick nap. It was midday and the place was well lit through all of the windows. Something caused her to wake suddenly. There was a pale white creature squatting on the floor looking right at her. The creature had its head resting on its knees. It was only a few inches from her face. There was no hair anywhere, but she couldn't remember the color of the eyes. The skin was white, and it was so thin she could see the bones through it. As she was torn between being terrified and curious as to what it was. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. She never did find out what it was or how it got into her house. Another home intruder report came from a 14-year-old boy. He had fallen asleep on the couch. After a few minutes, he woke and he thought he should head to the bedroom. As he was about to get off the couch, he heard a weird sound coming from down around the floor. Something was crawling around, making a whooshing sound on the carpet. Whatever it was moving real fast by the way the sound was being made. He noticed the sound was getting closer to the couch where he lay. The thing was crawling on the carpet, and it was coming towards him. Then the sound began to move back to where he had first heard it. It was as if this thing was circling around. It was now about 5 feet away. His curiosity got the better of him, so he looked at where the sound was coming from. He saw a weird-looking creature on the floor, down on all fours, only it was facing up. Its stomach was aimed at the ceiling, and the back was pointed downwards towards the floor. It had pale skin, it was super thin, and it was completely naked. There was no hair anywhere on it. Looking at this bizarre creature, he thought of one of the characters in the video game Silent Hills. The creature slunk back into the darkness and vanished. There was nowhere it could have gone since the wall was right there, but it was gone anyway. A man was walking his German Shepherd when he became aware of something dead nearby. He could smell that unmistakable odor of something decaying. The smell of death was around him. Yes, that's a Leonard Skinner reference. He looked around the woods, wondering what had died out there among the trees. Movement caught his eye. Something very white was crawling along, heading towards where the smell seemed to be coming from. As it got closer, he was able to see it was kind of human-looking. This thing was on its hands and feet, crawling with its butt high up in the air. Pale white skin and bones visible through its skin. There was no hair, and he could see the spine was jutting up through its back. The creature in the woods must have realized it was being watched because it darted to a tree about 20 feet away, making the distance in just a second or two. The man got out his flashlight and he aimed it at the thing, which was now behind a tree. It had curled its body into a ball with its hands and feet right next to each other. The witness was weirded out by seeing the creature. Keeping one eye on where the thing was, he got his dog and began walking away, hoping to never see anything like it again. Once he and his dog got home, the witness went online and he looked for images of the creature he had just seen. He found the Rake image on his computer, probably the same one I had seen, and he figured that's what he had seen. The idea of it being a ghoul also crossed his mind. A ghoul is a demon that hangs out in graveyards and feeds on the dead. Once it has consumed a body, the ghoul will take on the appearance of whoever it has eaten. On occasion, ghouls have been known to kill people before eating them. There are dozens of videos on YouTube claiming to be of the Pail Crawlers or Rakes, and sometimes Skinwalkers. In April 2019, a couple of guys were working on a video near McCollum Lake in Illinois, just north of Chicago. They had chosen a spot on a road between a cornfield and a wooded area to shoot some footage. People had reported seeing something in that area, and they wanted to do a video on cryptids, and this was the place to do it. They were standing in the road, one filming the other as he talked about what people were reporting. The one speaking was looking past the guy using the camera. He saw something moving through the corn. It was pale white and hunched over, walking using its hands and feet. It was too dark to get a good look until the thing got closer to a street light. He could now see the thing was all skin and bones. Its arms and legs were too long compared to its body. It crossed the road and entered the woods before the guy with the camera could turn around and have a look. Naturally, the camera guy thought his friend was jerking his chain. The guy who saw the creature began to think that somebody was messing with them. The thing had looked too much like something out of a horror movie. They wrapped up their video and left. The next day, the witness returned to the scene and looked around to see if he could maybe spot any kind of a track from this creature. He did see hand and footprints in the dirt. The toes looked inhumanly long, and they had claws on the ends. He decided it was time to get out of there and go looking for cryptids somewhere else. A couple in Westville, Nova Scotia spotted a huge yellow orb in the sky over their house. It landed in the trees nearby. Shortly after the orb had landed, they saw a tall, pale creature crawling through the woods. The creature was tall, but it was hunched over, using its hands as well as its feet to move. It looked as if it would lunge forward a bit, and then it would move back a few feet, as if it wasn't sure how to get to the next place. Its skin was pale, and it was completely hairless. The thing's bones could be seen through the skin. The couple stood there watching it move. They both tried to record the thing on their cell phones, but at the time, cell phones weren't all that good. They couldn't catch any good images in the dark. The creature was in their backyard for about 2 hours, moving back and forth as if it were looking for something. They thought it must have covered just about every square inch of the yard before turning and heading back into the woods. Some folks are convinced what they're seeing is some kind of an alien, like a gray, only taller. And the eyes are yellow instead of black. Since it's a different type of alien, folks are calling them tall white aliens instead. Tall white aliens are said to be between 7 and 8 feet tall. Their tall, slender bodies have a pale, chalk white color, and these extraterrestrials are said to thrive in arid, dry atmospheres. Tall whites have very large eyes that are blue when they're born. I don't know who knows this, but somebody said so. Kind of like a kitten's eyes. They turn pink as the aliens age. There is no report of them having yellow eyes. Tall whites are said to be physically weak from numerous genetic manipulations to their genes. Their lanky limbs can propel them a lot faster than any human runner. An ex-military weather specialist said the U.S. government, and probably most governments, knew these things are here, and some of them are walking around amongst us. He said that back in 1964 he was assigned to the Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. During his time there, he had seen many interactions between government officials and these extremely tall white creatures. And now we have a choice to make. Are these things folks are seeing rakes, skinwalkers, wendigo, white aliens, or just pale crawlers, as many folks believe? As for the rake, it's just the name given to something seen by many folks. Some say the rake was an invention from creepypasta. Yes, they gave it a name, but the creature had been seen for years before the internet was even dreamed up. As for skinwalkers, these are people who have abandoned their humanity to seek power, which allows them to take on the shape and characteristics of animals. Once in their animal form, they look and act like animals. They are mimicking. They take on animal forms, not monster. A wendigo is a demon that can possess a human. They are ravenous, and they will eat their own flesh if they can't find a human to consume. The wendigo keeps growing, getting taller with each life it consumes. Most sightings say the creature has antlers on its head, looking more like a deer than a person. They're almost always seen standing or moving on 2 legs. Could a Wendigo crawl to its intended victim? We can't say for sure since the victims don't usually survive to tell us what they saw. The folks seeing the Pail Crawler have said it didn't try to attack them. Usually it just screamed and ran away. As for them being aliens, this is possible. Aliens don't think and act like we do, so anything acting in a bizarre and explainable manner could be from some distant star. I tend to go with the idea that aliens aren't found eating roadkill or screaming and running away. We don't know what all might be found on our planet. If there are dozens of other dimensions and things once in a while slip across the barrier between them, maybe we're seeing some trans-dimensional being that comes from a world where its behavior is normal. It could also be, having found itself in our world, the creature doesn't know how to behave. Then again, Pail Crawlers could be some kind of a creature that has lived on our planet for centuries. Anyone seeing one would keep the story to themselves, not wanting to be considered crazy or in league with the devil. Too many folks today go through life focused on an electronic device cradled in their hands. A cell phone zombies. I've seen some of these folks unable to function without their phones, kind of like Brick without a book. I'm sure Pail Crawlers have been seen in other countries. I was looking for reports from other parts of the world, and I ran out of time on the show. I might have to do a second show soon. If you enjoyed the show, tell others they should listen up and enjoy it as well. Or just enjoy the show by yourself and let me know if you enjoy it or not. Who am I to tell you what to do? Don't forget, Christmas is coming up fast. It's time to buy those gifts. I've already done my Christmas shopping. Brag, brag. If you'd like to contact me, you can get a hold of me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. If you want to hear all of the archives and you're listening on one of the many platforms, you can find all 285 shows on iHeartRadio or on YouTube. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?